Hello, good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. I'm Indu Saxena at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers, and today I'm joined with my colleague, Christopher Kolakowski, and we are delighted to have Ambassador Derek Mitchell with this, our special event. This is the launch of our new podcast that is Indo-Pacific Optics. And for this inaugural episode, we have Ambassador to start with the Ambassador on the topic of ongoing conflict in Myanmar and the security situations. Thank you, Ambassador, for your time. We welcome you at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers.
Thank you very much, Indu and Chris. It's my great honor.
Before moving to the substance, it's my privilege and a great honor to introduce Ambassador Mitchell here. Ambassador Mitchell is the president of the National Democratic Institute and a senior advisor at the Office of the President and Asia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Formerly, he served as an ambassador of Myanmar from 2012 to 2016 in President Obama's administration. He was the first ambassador of Myanmar during that time in 22 years when there was a democratic transition in Myanmar. He also worked in the Biden administration with the Summit of Democracy that was held in 2021. He served as the Principal Defense Secretary of Asia-Pacific Security Affairs. He served as a special representative and the policy coordinator for Burma with the rank of ambassador. From 2009 to 2011, Ambassador Mitchell oversaw the U.S. Defense Department's Asia policy and the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs, and served as the Acting Assistant Secretary, for which he awarded the Office of the Secretary of Defense Award for his distinguished public service. He served as a special assistant to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs from 1997 to 2001. We are very honored and delighted to have you, Ambassador. And now we start our discussion with the topic, Myanmar's ongoing conflict and the security situation. As we all know that it has been like since the February 2021, military junta took the control of the elected government, and after that, there is a continuous and consistent voice for the democratic movement from the National Unity Government and the other from the citizens and from the other alliances who are registering for the democracy. So for my first questions, as we know, Ambassador, that Myanmar's military junta continue to face the oppositions and protests from the public and the resistance alliances, where we see that the China has emerged as a prominent mediator between the conflict parties. Recently, we saw in the news that China, and we know that China holds a significant interest in the Myanmar with the BRI project and the otherwise. So Myanmar has been a long-time ally of the military regime. That China has a strategic goals in getting the conflict and attempting to gain leverage in its competition with the United States and allies in the Indo-Pacific region? Ambassador, over to you, please.
Yes. Well, again, thank you, Indu, for this opportunity. Well, first of all, there's not a lot of trust between China and Myanmar and even the military regime. They have had over the years, a kind of a meeting of interest, but not a lot of trust. They have a long history together. The Myanmar people have a long history with a long border. Their border is about 2,100 kilometers. And China throughout history has, through various times, imperial days, invaded across the border. The Chinese had supported communist movements in the old days, during the Maoist days, and other insurgent movements across the border in Myanmar. And in fact, there are some of these movements that have killed colleagues of these current junta leaders. So these leaders have seen comrades die at the hands of those supported by China. They don't trust the Chinese. They don't trust these folks. And I think that was one of the reasons, frankly, that Myanmar, the old junta, 10, 15 years ago, evolved and reached out to the United States and others because they did not want to have to rely on China. So just as a first point, it's important to mention in your premise in the question about a close relationship between the military regime and China. It's a marriage of convenience when Myanmar has no other choices, but they do not trust each other very much. And certainly the Myanmar people and even the military does not towards the Chinese. So let me get to the specifics of your question of the current moment where the Chinese are, as you say, mediating the conflicts that are ongoing within the country. The Chinese have several reasons for this, several interests when it comes to Myanmar. Number one, I think they see Myanmar as fundamentally their sphere of influence. Traditionally, this is, as they see most of Asia, all of Asia, that's why they are interested in undoing America's place in Asia, is they want to reassert that sphere of influence on their periphery. So they want in Myanmar, they see an opportunity now to reassert predominance in a key country in their sphere of influence that they see as their Western border and their access to the Indian Ocean. So there's a great interest in access to the Indian Ocean and predominance along a very insecure border that can be a locus for instability. That's what that's a second interest. They're seeing instability based on the result of this coup and simply the longstanding internal conflicts in Myanmar. That's always been an unstable border where there can be cross-border crime, human trafficking, drug trafficking, all kinds of trafficking of sorts, and cross-border crime. And most recently, there have been these scam operations you may have been reading about if people follow what's going on there, with, again, drugs and prostitution, but also these phone scam operations that scam Chinese out of their money that operate from the border. So some of it is also China wanting to get a grip on what is becoming a much less secure border than even before. And some of these hostilities along the border are crossing into China, leading to civilian casualties. Some of the bombs, some of the hostile activity are causing the deaths of Chinese. So there's that interest of the Chinese getting involved and creating some kind of mitigation and mediation of this conflict. They also want to demonstrate, this is long-standing, this goes to their predominance inside the country and the desire for influence. They want to demonstrate that there can never be peace, there can never be security, there can never be stability inside the country without China. They were very concerned when the United States, during my days, were making inroads and the Myanmar government was leaning a bit more towards the United States. They were very insecure about that. And I think the Chinese always want to demonstrate they can turn the screws and nothing can actually happen here. There can never really be peace without China. And they want to keep Myanmar dependent. So they play all sides in order to maintain that kind of generalized control. I think that's important to remember as a factor here. So this preventing of encirclement by the United States or our allies and others definitely plays a role, but they also have a real interest in exploiting resources, exploiting access, enabling the maintenance of control by China in this unfortunate country. And let me just tell you one finally before I end on an anecdote. And it tells you just how I think when you mentioned the relationship between the military and China, and it gives you a sense of the tense nature of it. When I was ambassador, the Chinese were always asking, and then of course the civil war and these dialogues between the Burmans, dominant Burman government, and the ethnics were going on. The Chinese would always insert themselves and say, we would like to mediate these conflicts, particularly with the Kachin, who have a long border with China. And I remember one time hearing from one of those in the room for the Myanmar side who said that when this was brought up to the Myanmar side said, no, we don't want you to facilitate. The Chinese said, well, if we can't facilitate, can we organize? No, you can't organize. And then they said, can we mediate? They said, no, you cannot mediate this. They said, this is our sovereign issue, the Myanmar government said. And what they said back to the Chinese was, you can mediate in Kachin if we mediate in Tibet, which what I thought was a remarkably gutsy thing to say to the Chinese by a small country. It was very insecure, but it also told me just how much they want to keep the Chinese out of their sovereign interest and their sovereign territory, their sovereign activity. But the fact that they're now inviting them in to mediate, I remember that anecdote. It makes me think, aha, well, something that shows just how desperate the Myanmar military is, that they're actually inviting the Chinese to mediate. And of course, we know the mediation is really not working very well, but they're so desperate, they're willing to try the Chinese.
I just want to jump in, if I may, Indu, just
Sure.
a couple of the
Yeah,
comments that the
sure,
ambassador made, I thought were right on. I just want to amplify a little bit about the geography and a little bit about China, why Myanmar matters to China. And you can go back actually 80 years and see some of these echoes as well. First of all, China is building an expressway from Kunming west to the border along the old Burma Road corridor. And if you look at the point the ambassador I thought I made was very strong in that, Yangon, Rangoon is the easiest access China has to the Indian Ocean. And so that makes it very of great interest to the Chinese. It's been there certainly since the Burma Road was opened in 1940, if not earlier. And so I think that's part of it. The other thing is let's not forget that if you look at China's southern border, if you look at China's strategic, where their borders are, the plains of Asia offer a certain level of security to the northwest, to any threats from the northwest. Same with Siberia to the north, although they've had their historical problems with the Russians. The eastern border, first island chain, that's always been. But the southern border, the one place that there's been threat is coming in from Myanmar. And the ambassador talked about that some. There's still simmering issues with territorial claims. But the other thing that should be mentioned is, when people think about the Japanese invasion in 1937, yeah, they invaded from the east, but in 1942 they invaded up the Burma Road and were stopped at the Salween River, not that far inside of China. So this has proven to be a traditional invasion route, and that conflict is spilling over. And if you look at the history, Burma, Myanmar, whatever, to use both names, is sort of a hinge geographically in that region. It's a crossroads if you're going east or west, north or south.
Yep.
And if you think about not just China, but you look at the interests of everybody else in Southeast Asia, this conflict, there's a lot of concern that it's already spilling over, and it may destabilize or may affect this region for a long time to come. And so as we think about this, the geography, geography is destiny is the old quote. And I think there's certainly a lot of truth to that in the history of this country, in the history of Myanmar, and elsewhere for sure. But that should not be forgotten.
Yeah. And let me add also Indu, did you have something to say? I can add to this as well.
Yeah, sure. Ambassador, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, just that a few things. One, the access to the Indian Ocean, Bay of Bengal does go through Yangon. It also goes west into Rakhine State. So the Chinese are building a special port, deep water port, as part of what people call the string of pearls of ports throughout Southeast and South Asia for access. But this is in Chokpu, that along the Indian Ocean to the west, that the Belt and Road go into. There's a lot of oil and gas around there. They want to take the oil, get oil from the Indian Ocean, move it across land into their west, into Yunnan. And it bypasses those who I'm sure who listen to this know about the Malacca dilemma that the Chinese have. They have most of their oil and gas and trade run through the Malacca Straits, through Singapore, between Singapore, Indonesia. And that's a choke point because the United States has naval dominance traditionally around there. So they see that as a point of vulnerability. And Burma is a place where they can get around that vulnerability. The other thing to think about the geography, internal geography of Burma, Myanmar, is they have a ring of sort of a horseshoe, an inverted horseshoe of mountains that run from the west coast up to the north and then down the east coast. And that's always been a kind of a natural barrier for invasion. So I always say the way that the Burmese or the Myanmar people have resisted Chinese incursions going back to the 18th century and before were a combination of mountains and malaria. The mountains would slow them down, and the malaria would hit and wipe them out. And you know, Chris is a historian, what malaria meant to the forces in the 40s. But those types of things provided a good deal of security. And the final thing I'll say, just because I didn't want to get too deep into this history, but it's important. Another reason why the Chinese historically have worried about this vulnerable western coast of theirs, or western border, is when the Chinese Communist Party took over, the Kuomintang not only escaped east to Taiwan, but they also escaped west to Burma. And they kept up a lot of the insurgency for years, supported by the CIA, in fact, in the 50s, through the Kuomintang in Burma to kind of cause problems to the Chinese from the West. So I think the Chinese always remember this and want to make sure they are not vulnerable, to the West from Myanmar. And suffice to say, that has not been the interest of the United States to make Myanmar into that. When I was ambassador and there was an opening, that was not the thought here at all. And in fact, I reached out to the Chinese at one point and said, look, why don't we work together here? Because we have common interest, prevent instability, to promote, ASEAN unity, et cetera, et cetera. And we can work to help this benighted country succeed for the common interest. And they weren't interested because they see this as their sphere of influence, to the point where they even told me, the ambassador who had just arrived just as I was leaving said, do not go to Kachin State, do not go to Shan State, which is on the border of China. You must respect our interests. In other words, that's our sphere. You shouldn't go there as America, which I found to be abhorrent for the sovereignty of Myanmar. So the last trip I took was to Kachin State before I left as ambassador.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. That's a great discussion and insight. I just learned from your talk that it's a marriage of convenience. Like China doesn't want benignly that the region succeed, or region for the peace and stability, that work for the peace and stability. That you mentioned that. You were asked that don't go there. So at the same time, like I just want to point out for the India, India has a border with Myanmar. India has a border with China, and when the India's official or the ministers, they go to the Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh, and then there is a kind of criticism or something. The comments comes from the Chinese, so that don't go there. So this kind of thing, so that situation is very complex here in the scenario, but we see that the resistance movement, the people wants democracy, or people wants the peace and stability, their rights. So moving ahead for the next question, whenever I think, it's not my personal opinion, and maybe it's as a whole South Asian, Southeast Asian, we see that United States should do more on there. So while this is my thought that Myanmar is a weak link in the US Indo-Pacific strategy, and do you think that the US should be involved here at this point? If yes, what are the appropriate strategies to the US to engage with the involved parties? Or if not, how can the US move forward with its relations with Myanmar? Ambassador, over to you, please.
Yeah, well, thank you, Indu, for that question. Well, first of all, I would say the United States government is already very actively involved, in not just the US government, the Biden administration, but the US Congress, which has always had a great interest, a deep interest in Myanmar, particularly individual members and staff. So there is still active support for the democratic forces in opposition to the junta, the National Unity Government, the NUCC, all these different acronyms, as well as the ethnic forces. There's been allowance, for instance, to provide, now under law, we're allowed to provide non-lethal assistance to the ethnicities, even those who are fighting. Traditionally, if there is an insurgency, a fight, violence, we don't provide lethal assistance to those forces or any assistance to those forces. Now there's authorization to provide non-lethal assistance, though, frankly, I think there's much more we can be doing on communications, on providing them more of equipment, again, non-lethal equipment, They need that desperately, particularly communications, so they can, hide in defense. If there's an attack coming, they can communicate better. There are sanctions. There have been sanctions that are biting. There are banking sanctions. And Singapore is actually quietly doing more. And I think we've helped in bringing along Singapore, where a lot of the banking is done by the government and by some of the junta individuals themselves. So that stuff is biting. They have less dollar denominated currencies that they can bring to the fore, and that's causing problems, squeezing the junta over time. I do think there's more we can be doing on humanitarian assistance and putting pressure on the Thais and frankly the Indians to allow more access from the West and from the East. The humanitarian needs are grave. They're desperate. Half of the country now is below the poverty line, they're saying. The latest word. Jobs are not easy to find. It's a desperate situation inside the country, and they need that assistance. And that's only going to come from border. The Chinese can help. The Thais can do a lot more. The Indians, frankly, can do a lot more along those lines. I think the United States, working within the Quad or with the Japanese or others, can do more and put more attention on it. I also think, I've said this from the start quietly, but I think there needs to be, and I don't say this self-interestedly, I'm not looking for a job, but you mentioned I was a special envoy before I was ambassador. We have a special envoy who is extremely qualified, based in Washington, Derek Chalet, and he's been doing a wonderful job in coordinating things and traveling out there and making sure sanctions are in place. But I felt from the start that we need an envoy in the region. That it needs to be someone based perhaps in Jakarta or somewhere to coordinate various efforts around the region, to bring sort of unified strategic pressure on the government to keep the fires going and the momentum going. I would say that's still needed. And I think there needs to be more to work with the opposition on what the post-Civil War Myanmar will look like. That is the big question. Promote trust building and unity amongst the opposition forces. As difficult as that is, perhaps we can do a little bit more. But let me just say finally on this question, this is very hard for the US government. I think there's a lot of interest in this. It comes up in the talking points and the conversations with the Chinese and all the regional conversations. Myanmar comes up as a priority and it's discussed. But as we all know, there are a lot of issues on the plate of the US government right now. Just in Asia, you've got Taiwan, you've got the South China Sea, you got the overall rise of China and the balance there, which causes a lot of attention. And then we're hearing now about North Korea, DPRK. And what is that about? More attention on potential war and such. That's not just even mention Ukraine and Gaza, Israel. So all of these issues, I think, are playing against the United States, putting the kinds of resources in that are necessary to make a difference. And unfortunately, with the situation being what it is in Myanmar, it's hard to see anything easy, no easy answers. When you have limited resources in time and otherwise, where are you going to place that? You place it in kind of the immediate crises where you can make a real difference. And I'm worried that there's a feeling that it's so complex, so difficult, so intractable at the moment that the primary resources are being placed elsewhere. And I can understand it, even as someone who's personally invested, deeply invested in the success of the country and sees the strategic value of the country, as Chris talked about, of its location and otherwise. It's still, I can understand why the United States is not able to do more than it has, even if I wish it could.
Thank you, Mr.
I would agree with that. I would just say real quick, there are US allies on several sides of Myanmar. And I think you're right, with everything the US government is dealing with, the United States, whatever is done, whatever the United States is able to achieve is going to have to be done through its allies in the region. Yes. The point is well taken.
That's right.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. and Chris. I fully agree with this point that at least someone should be there in the region to talk about, or at least to bring the parties, or not to, at least for the civilian stake from the United States and from India too, like Ambassador, you mentioned there, because India's two states, like we say province, they are border with Myanmar, Manipur and Mizoram, that we saw the recent violence in Indian state. But again, the things comes. The elephant in the room is China, that while India has a standoff in the Himalayan border since 2022, and India's quite policy towards Myanmar maybe is the reason for that, so that not aggravate the situation over there, but at least US and allies and the partners should come for the peace and stability for the region. And I just want Ambassador a brief comment on the we talked about China. So Russia is the largest supplier of arms to Myanmar.
Yeah.
So what do you say about this Russia's involvement there? Because after the coup, the first person or the first minister who visited Myanmar was the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
Yes.
That means like you are just accepting, you are recognizing or endorsing the coup. That's so. What's your take on this?
Well, I mean, Myanmar is slipping into being part of this new sort of axis, as it were. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran to a degree, and as a very, very junior partner, Myanmar in all this. But you can't go a day without seeing some Russian official in Myanmar or an announcement of some kind of cooperative endeavor between Myanmar and Russia. Or even Min Aung Hlaing has been to Russia several times. They're sending people for education, they're sending them for training. This is something that had happened before the opening 10, 15 years ago, that there was activities like this, including a nuclear technology, which was creating concerns about potential nuclear weapons development at the time, which I think was overdrawn in those days, but we can never be complacent about that. But absolutely, I think the Russians are providing a lot of weapons now to Myanmar. Myanmar, though, doesn't have, as I mentioned, doesn't have hard currency like they used to. So I think that might start to slow, but they have, again, common interest, I think, between Russia and Myanmar, because they're both pariahs, they're both being isolated, they're both in need, and they both have what each other needs. One is currency, the other, they both need weapons. So it's something absolutely to watch. I also don't know that the Chinese are terribly happy about a robust Russian relationship with Myanmar, but I don't know that Russia will have that much difference in their, or have much impact vis-a-vis China inside the country. But it is something absolutely to watch, that the Russians and the Myanmar government may find common cause to create more instability along with the Chinese in Southeast Asia. And it's a way for the Russians to get a little wedge into Southeast Asia as well. They're looking to do more in Asia. They're doing more in Northeast Asia. I think this is their wedge in Southeast Asia.
Absolutely, because the Russians have their ambitions to the Indian Ocean too. Like so, they also need the Myanmar. Ambassador, so my next question, like we are going to heading towards the ASEAN. So ASEAN just proposed the 5-point consensus, and the military junta rejected that. So how do you see that now Lao as a new chair of the ASEAN? How do you see that they sent the special envoy recently, and how do you see the ASEAN's roles too? Because we know that military junta is not listening anything from the ASEAN, and ASEAN is also divided in the Myanmar. So
yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head on that front. I mean, ASEAN can play an absolutely key role in this. They should play a central role. Myanmar is a member of ASEAN. ASEAN invited them into their grouping back 25 years ago. Because they felt that was a way to manage Myanmar, bring them in, engage them, and you can help shape their positive trajectory. That clearly has not worked lately, certainly, and they're not. I think that the efforts have been rather feeble, if I may say, but it's hamstrung, as you say, by division, by internal division. They're hamstrung by their own constraints of their sort of consensus tradition, where they operate by consensus, and if there's not a consensus, they're kind of hamstrung. So you're seeing some countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, even Philippines being a little more forward-leaning and criticizing Myanmar, even taking some action and trying to get change. while others, Vietnam, Cambodia, and even to some degree has been Thailand, trying to be less pressure, putting less pressure on Myanmar and saying, don't involve ourselves in their internal affairs, which is not having any good effect in Myanmar, and frankly is an embarrassment to ASEAN. And I think it actually doesn't do any good for these countries. As you suggest, I mean, Thailand as a border country is getting the brunt of refugees, of instability on the border, of trafficking issues, arms, drugs, human trafficking. I mean, all of this is coming at the expense of the stability and security of the region. And so they have a very, a self-interest in protecting their reputation, protecting against a failed state rising right in their midst, with impact not only, on the immediate neighbors, but more broadly on the health and viability of the region. So I think it's hard for ASEAN given the divisions, but they must and they should do much more than they have.
Just on a comment on this, so do you see that it's like you talked about the Thailand? So do you see that the lack of democracy in the Thailand itself can be the reason for that?
I think it was for the last 10 years to a degree, because the military, there's a connection, actually a personal connection, between the current chair of the Special Administrative Council, or the commander-in-chief of the Myanmar military, Min Aung Hlaing, and the military in Thailand. They've had over the years an interesting personal relationship between certain individuals on both sides. Over the centuries, they've had a very tense relationship. I mean, you ask the Thais about history, and they will tell you about how the Myanmar military almost sacked Bangkok, came very close to historic old Bangkok in the old days, and they worry about a stronger Myanmar, because Myanmar traditionally has been dominated by military generals, have been very much militarized country over the centuries. But there have been some of these connections, and I think over the past 10 years, yes, I think there's been a comradeship. And some people theorize, I think it's not unwisely, I theorize this, that Min Aung Hlaing in Myanmar may have looked at the coup in 2014 in Thailand and felt that that might have been a model, that, Thailand effected a coup, that people said, oh, this is terrible. The United States froze some things for a while. And then after a year, people got used to it and moved on. And I think that's what the Myanmar military may have felt, that they can get away with this. They can go back, have a reset. It wasn't going quite the way they thought before, that it would in the opening of the previous 10 years. Aung San Suu Kyi was, actually running circles around them a bit. They couldn't find a good relationship with her. So let's do a reset, have a coup, tighten up the constitution, have another election, and use Thailand as a model. But Thailand is not Burma or not Myanmar, and that didn't work. But yes, I do think, getting to your question again, a little bit of a tangent, I think the lack of democracy had an impact. And I believe you saw the opposition in Thailand that won a plurality, actually won the majority, but couldn't form a government. They were looking to have a much more open relationship with the opposition, with the democratic forces, if they were to take over. They talked about having humanitarian corridors, et cetera. But the current government is moving slowly, but advisedly, I think, on a full change of policy towards the junta.
Yeah. To hear from you that at the time of the Aung San Suu Kyi, she coordinated a bit with the military regime, but again, couldn't agree more than that. And then now they put him in prison, and recently we saw that deteriorating condition of Miss Aung San Suu Kyi, and her family was asking some relief, but that couldn't happen. So all this from the geopolitical and from those all humanitarian condition, it's like the situation is worse. And of course, sometimes when we see in the as ASEAN as a successful institutions in a history, so finding some solutions, and so people look at the ASEAN's efforts. So there's a lot more to discuss, and it's so interesting. But Ambassador, you know that we have the time limitations, and you also have the more appointment there. And then I am just heading towards our last question here. So in the light of the increasing control that insurgent groups have been exerting over various towns and regions, recently we saw that they held the town in the Indian border, and then growing concerns and eventual outcome of the civil war that you mentioned in your answer. So as the situation on the ground continues to evolve, what might the final solution do you suggest, or in your what's your takeaway for the final resolutions?
Yeah, there's a long way to go from here to there, and all we've seen in the past now 3 years since the coup, almost 3 years. February 1st will be 3 years. It's just more trauma, more guns, less trust in a country that had enormous trauma, a lot of guns, and no trust among the very highly diverse people of the country. So it's dug even a deeper hole. And so any resolution coming out of this conflict will be even harder than before. But we're seeing now, I think, the resolution has always had to be a highly federated state at best. At best, the resolution would be that the groundwork is being laid for a highly federated state, so that you have autonomous areas around a unified state of some kind. But now you're seeing not just federation around the major ethnicities in the major states, like the Karen, the Kachin, the Kaya, the Chin, the Mon, all of that, the Rakhine, but also these sub-regional groups that you're hearing about, that in localities within states that are rising and asserting their own autonomy, their militias and others, but small ethnicities, as it were, asserting their rights and autonomy in localized areas. So how do they get taken care of? They now have guns. They now feel empowered. They want to assert their rights. What do you do about them, about the Wa, about, folks like that? So again, at best, the resolution will be coming together in unity, coming together amidst all this diversity and division to a unified but highly federated state where there's equal justice for the various ethnicities. That's been the defining challenge of the country. People talk about democracy versus autocracy there being defining challenge, democracy versus the junta. But actually is, how does this place hold together peacefully without use of force? And that's must give rights to the ethnics. So has to be now a lot more attention toward the ethnics, the ethnicities, the ethnic minorities, the nationalities, then to the center and Aung San Suu Kyi and the rest, to the Burmans, where we've always put our emphasis. The ethnic nationalities now need to get a lot more attention, because they're going to be part of that resolution. They have to be part of whatever peace comes afterwards. It also requires, frankly, a revolutionary mindset, therefore. The Burman majority have always had this mindset that they dominate. And there's an old guard, very much sort of about old. It's about age, but it needs to be a change in generational perspectives. It needs to be visionary leadership. It's not clear yet if that exists, if there is an acceptable new generation, there's an acceptable new visionary leadership within these ethnicities or broadly throughout the country. And it can capture, the fullness of this country, that can build trust. That's what's going to be required. And it's not clear that exists yet. So the one thing that's united the country, I'll end on this. The one thing that's united the country always has been the fight against the military, but the unity around a common vision for something, for a country, for what holds this place together has been the classic challenge for Myanmar. And that's what's going to lead towards a result we hope to see.
Yeah, that's we hope to see, it's a third anniversary of the coup is coming, and since October we have seen so without the violence, and how they can regard and respect the ethnicity and to maintain the peace and stability. Chris, do you have the last comment, or should we close it?
I think the ambassador's comments are well taken. I think it's a situation that in some ways rivals the former Yugoslavia and some of the ethnic tensions in that area. And I'd simply say, when people look at this, democracy, pro-democracy versus, versus the junta, yes, but we should never forget the ethnic piece to this, and that it vastly complicates the situation. And you're right. Until they figure out how to solve that and how to put that back together against a shared vision, I see a long, bloody road ahead before we get there. And it pains me to say that because it's a great country and a great people. But I think the ambassador's points are very well taken, and it highlights the complexity of the situation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ambassador, for your valuable time and your insightful comments. Thank you so much from our team, and we look forward for many more discussion with you on the situation and the Southeast Asia region as well.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.